You can go ahead, Dr. Rana.
All right, great. So thank you everybody for joining. Like Autumn was saying, is we are from the University of Chicago. I am going to talk about management of hypertension in pregnancy. And I am an OBGYN here, maternal fetal medicine at the University of Chicago. So what kind of the purpose is we are going to review this new bulletin that was just released and updated in, this was actually released in 2018, but was then subsequently updated in 2020. And essentially, I'm just going to go through some of the management plans for gestational hypertension, preeclampsia, chronic hypertension, superimposed preeclampsia, but also the program that we have created here at the University of Chicago for the management of antepartum and postpartum hypertension. So we all know this, preeclampsia is a common hypertensive disorder of pregnancy, and unfortunately still it's responsible for a lot of maternal deaths. So worldwide, about 70,000 maternal deaths and 500,000 fetal deaths are actually related to high blood pressures in pregnancy and preeclampsia. And again, a very kind of stark reality for us here in Illinois is that African American women, so in US, the maternal mortality is going up, but African American women are about 3 to 4 times higher risk of dying from pregnancy complications, and preeclampsia is actually a common contributor to this maternal morbidity and mortality. So this is the national data. This, as you can see here, the red line here is the US mortality compared to all the other developed countries. So while all the other developed countries have actually reduced their maternal mortality, US is the only country where the maternal mortality is actually going up. So what are the reasons? So this is a paper that was published a few years ago now by Dr. Elliot Main in California. And what they did was they looked at all their maternal morbidity and mortality across the state. So they came back with few points, such as preeclampsia is a common cause of maternal morbidity and mortality. And when they looked at preeclampsia-related deaths, they thought that about 60%, so more than half of the deaths, have a good to strong chance of altering the outcomes with intervention. Obviously, some of the times interventions were delayed because of various different reasons, but there was a good chance that you could actually change the outcome of the patient. So maybe she won't die or she won't suffer the severe morbidity. So what did they find? So there was a significant proportion of patients, there was a delayed response to warning signs. So, you know, all those warning signs that we keep telling patients, headache, blurred vision, those were just either not recognized, or there was a delayed response to those warning signs. There was ineffective care, so it's mostly because of delay in diagnosis, and also a significant proportion of patients were actually misdiagnosed. So we know this, there are several complications of preeclampsia, and the way I look at it, I feel there are immediate complications of preeclampsia, which we guys are seeing on labor delivery floor. So preeclampsia can lead to placental abruption. We have House syndrome. Obviously, we all have seen eclampsia. Preeclampsia can lead to liver and kidney dysfunction. There is fetal growth restriction. Preeclampsia and high blood pressures of pregnancy are actually one of the most common reasons for preterm birth. Cardiomyopathy, so that can happen, just heart failure, frankly, from preeclampsia, and also rarely maternal death, but commonly fetal death as well. But again, to be aware of, this is not just the preeclampsia is not the disease that gets actually treated by delivery. So previously people would say, oh yeah, you know, the cure for preeclampsia is delivery. That's not true. Preeclampsia, just maybe some of the signs and symptoms get resolved with delivery, but preeclampsia itself leads to a long-term cardiovascular risk. So such as women who have a history of preeclampsia are at high risk to develop cardiovascular disease such as hypertension. Patients are at increased risk to have myocardial infarction, congestive heart failure, stroke, peripheral arterial disease, as well as CVD mortality. So CVD mortality, death from cardiovascular disease, is about 2 times higher in patients who have hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. So for example, this is a recent study in which they looked at women who have hypertensive disorder of pregnancy. They were about 12 to 25-fold higher rate of hypertension compared to non-hypertensive patients within a year of delivery. So what it is that it's not just like very, very remote that you're going to develop hypertension, but you know, there's a mom-to-be study that showed that these risks are actually quite high as early as 2 to 7 years after delivery. And then, so while all this, we know that all these things are happening to the women, the flip side is there's a lack of physician awareness. So I did a study when I was in Boston, and just very, 30,000 foot view is that the internist and the OBGYN, a lot of them were unsure or did not know whether preeclampsia is associated with long-term cardiovascular disease, and very, very few number of internists. So in this particular study, less than 10% of the internists were even counseling patients who had preeclampsia about cardiovascular risk. So they didn't know that women who had preeclampsia had a risk for cardiovascular disease later in life, and they were obviously not counseling the patients appropriately. So preeclampsia is not just hypertension, and I just want to kind of hone in this point, is it's a multi-system disorder. Preeclampsia is really a disease of your vascular endothelium. So it's a disease of blood vessels. So essentially, if it affects your vascular endothelium, that leads to your high blood pressure. So blood pressures in certain types of preeclampsia, for example, severe types, HELLP syndrome may not be very, very severe, but blood pressure can be normal, mild, or severe. There's generalized capillary leak. So there is leak from your vessels are very leaky. That leads to certain symptoms such as proteinuria. You can have facial edema. Patients with preeclampsia can have pulmonary edema. Sometimes they can have ascites and pleural effusions. Preeclampsia also affects your fibrinolysis and hemolytic system, so it can lead to hemolysis, which we have all seen as a part of HELLP syndrome, but also it can lead to renal failure and DIC, and sometimes patients have partial HELLP syndrome, such as elevated liver enzymes and low platelets. And then obviously this consortium of symptoms such as epigastric pain from stretching of the liver capsule. Patients can have CNS symptoms such as headache, blurred vision, and spots in front of their eyes. They can have bleeding from abruption, and also nausea, vomiting just from the liver dysfunction. So it's a very multi-system disease. So this is just a picture of abruption. We all know it's the clot behind the placenta, and this can lead to can even lead to IUFD, but more commonly can lead to DIC. This is just a picture of pulmonary edema. PRES. So PRES is posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome. So this is from acute severe hypertension that can happen in these patients. And essentially it's the edema in the posterior brain that can be seen on MRI of the brain. And then this is just a picture of the patient that is resolved. So, however, there are actually newer studies showing that if you do MRI of these patients later on, they actually have evidence of brain damage many, many years after delivery with a preeclamptic pregnancy. It can also lead to anuria and renal failure. And obviously, we know that preeclampsia affects the baby, such as it's a common cause of stillbirth, fetal growth restriction, premature delivery, abruption, abnormal Dopplers, oligo, and like I said, prematurity. So we're going to dive right into some of the diagnostic criteria, which again has changed in the past several years. So now the diagnosis of preeclampsia is hypertension and proteinuria, and then there's a whole column of in the absence of proteinuria. So let's go from the top. So it's hypertension. How do we define hypertension? It's blood pressures more than or equal to 140 or 90. And previously they would be only one blood pressure, but now ACOG says you need to have at least two blood pressures that are 4 hours apart after 20 weeks of gestation, and that's just to improve the sensitivity of blood pressures. However, if you have severe hypertension, so if you have a patient whose blood pressure is more than 160 or 110, you can actually diagnose her with hypertension in pregnancy. You don't have to wait for 4 hours. You can diagnose her if she has two severe blood pressures, for example, even few minutes apart, because obviously you have to treat them. Then you can have hypertension. So this is new onset hypertension and proteinuria. So there are three ways of defining the proteinuria. One is you can do a urine protein creatinine ratio, which is the most common thing that we do in our clinics currently, and it has to be more than 0.3. You can also check a 24-hour urine protein. So that's currently the gold standard. If it's more than 300 milligrams, you qualify as you have proteinuria. And then when you don't have either urine protein creatinine ratio or 24-hour urine available, you can do a dipstick. And any dipstick of more than or equal to 1 plus is considered to be proteinuria. But then in the definition of preeclampsia, they added if you don't have proteinuria, so you can just have new onset hypertension in the absence of proteinuria, but in the presence of other end organ damage. So what are the different end organs you can look at? So if you have thrombocytopenia, defined as platelet count less than 100,000, renal insufficiency creatinine of more than 1.1, and then they say if you have a baseline creatinine and if you have no renal dysfunction, your patient has no renal dysfunction, and somehow her creatinine doubled, so she could be like 0.4, 0.5 at the beginning of her pregnancy, and suddenly she comes in and now she's 1.0 or 0.9, so it's less than 1.1, but you can define that as renal dysfunction. You can have elevated LFTs, and that have to be twice the upper limit of normal, and cerebral and visual symptoms and pulmonary edema are part of preeclampsia definition, even if you don't have proteinuria. And then they define preeclampsia. So there is no more mild preeclampsia. We should not be using the word mild because there's nothing mild about preeclampsia. It's a very deadly disease. So now preeclampsia is defined as preeclampsia and preeclampsia with severe features. And what are the severe features? So we just talked about them. One is severe hypertension. So if you have hypertension, but it's severe, you qualify as severe preeclampsia. And then if you have any of these end organ damage, you have severe disease. So you have thrombocytopenia, elevated LFT, renal insufficiency, pulmonary edema. Any of these things are happening in the context of hypertension with without proteinuria defines severe preeclampsia. And then they kind of took out IUGR from the diagnostic criteria because a lot of times patients would get delivered just because of IUGR. So ACOG now does not recognize IUGR in any of the diagnostic criteria of preeclampsia. So currently preeclampsia is defined only by maternal criteria. So we're going to go through common scenarios of how to manage these patients in the clinic. So management of chronic hypertension. So chronic hypertension is defined as hypertension, which you find in a patient prior to 20 weeks of gestation. So if you have a patient whose blood pressure is more than 140/90, and this is only even times 1 is fine, and she's less than 20 weeks, or most of our patients, they'll come in and they'll tell you they have a history of chronic hypertension. So in these patients, you should get baseline labs, ideally less than 20 weeks, so that you can differentiate when they develop preeclampsia to make sure they are really the baseline labs. ACOG says do an EKG and echo if the patient has severe hypertension for over 4 years. In my practice, and I see a lot of patients with hypertension, I actually do an echo on pretty much all these patients. And we've published in this data that patients who are obese and African American, they actually have subclinical cardiac dysfunction even if their ejection fraction is normal. So I typically do echoes on all my patients in mid-pregnancy who have a history of chronic hypertension. Then you can start them on antihypertensive. So the threshold for starting the antihypertensive is, according to ACOG, is really you have to have severe hypertension, so 160/105. So in all our practices, and in my practice, I have a much lower threshold of blood pressure of starting the antihypertensives. I typically start antihypertensives if the patient's blood pressures are over 150/100, and then your goal blood pressure should be somewhere between 120/160 or 80/105. That's what ACOG says, but I typically keep them less than 140/90. And then also, if you have patients who have end organ damage, so if you have somebody who's a diabetic or somebody who has renal dysfunction or cardiac disease, you really need their blood pressures to be really low. And in my clinic, I typically try to keep them less than 130/80. So I'm a little bit more of a conservative person to manage these hypertension in the clinic. And there's actually randomized trials done that patients who have lower blood pressures during pregnancy have lower risk of complications in relation to preeclampsia later in pregnancy. Then you have to do serial growth scans. ACOG doesn't really say exactly how frequently, but typically in clinical practice, we are doing them every 4 weeks. And then depending on if the patient is on medication or not, you can do antepartum surveillance. Pretty much I start doing antepartum surveillance if patients on multiple medications starting at 28 weeks, and most commonly after 32 weeks. And then you, depending again, whether you're on medication or not and how good your blood pressure control is, you can deliver them after 38 weeks. So you don't really have to wait for the entire 39 weeks. How do we, so what do we do for patients who have superimposed preeclampsia? So superimposed preeclampsia is a very confusing diagnosis for pretty much most of the people. But essentially what you're trying to say is that you already have chronic hypertension and somehow something else is happening. So what else could be happening? So if you have chronic hypertension and you do a baseline protein and you have no proteinuria, but now somehow after 20 weeks, you have new onset proteinuria, you can be diagnosed with superimposed preeclampsia. Other definitions include sudden increase in your blood pressures. So you're fine, and suddenly after 20 weeks, you're 26 weeks, suddenly your blood pressures start to go up. There's increasing need for medication. So even if you don't develop proteinuria, you can perhaps diagnose somebody with superimposed preeclampsia. If there is sudden, substantial, sustained increase in proteinuria, I don't really know what these words mean, but if you have mild proteinuria before, so if you have 320 milligrams and now suddenly some people say doubling of your proteinuria, that will characterize superimposed preeclampsia. I think the best definition is symptoms of severe disease. So when I see a patient who has chronic hypertension, but after 20 weeks, if she starts developing any of those severe features, so elevated liver enzymes, low platelet count, neurological symptoms, pulmonary edema, renal dysfunction, those are really hard labs and hard signs. So that can definitely diagnose a patient with superimposed preeclampsia. How do you manage patients with superimposed preeclampsia? So pretty similar to preeclampsia, and we're going to come back later to it, is that you treat them with antihypertensives if they have severe hypertension. For all preeclamptics, pretty much, whether superimposed or otherwise, ACOG recommends growth scans every 3 weeks because the IUGR is actually quite common. And then you do weekly NSTs and AFIs. And essentially what you do is that if you have no severe features, you deliver at 37 weeks, very similar to preeclampsia. And if you have severe features, you deliver them at at or before 34 weeks. How do you manage gestational hypertension? So again, gestational hypertension is kind of one of those things that you don't know which way it's going to go. So gestational hypertension is new onset hypertension, but without proteinuria or without any systemic findings. So all you have is mild degrees of hypertension. What do we do? You have to do daily monitoring of fetal movements. A significant proportion of patients who have gestational hypertension will actually end up having a diagnosis of preeclampsia later on. So what you have to do, you have to teach your patient for daily monitoring of symptoms of preeclampsia, such as headache, right upper quadrant pain, blurred vision, swelling of hands and feet, and swelling of face, shortness of breath. All those symptoms you have to teach the patients. Then you have to do blood pressure checks frequently. And typically what I do, I typically give the patient a blood pressure monitor. So she checks the blood pressure at home a couple of times a week. And then once a week, it should at least be in the office. When they come to your office, you have to do weekly assessment of labs and proteinuria. So essentially what you're trying to figure out if this woman has gestational hypertension or she has progressed to preeclampsia. You give them antihypertensives, you do serial growth scans. Again, we are doing growth scans every 4 weeks. And then for pretty much for gestational hypertension, you should deliver your patients at 37 weeks. And we can debate about it, but the most latest recommendation by ACOG is that we should give magnesium sulfate for seizure prophylaxis only for patients who have preeclampsia with severe features. So mild gestational hypertension or non-severe gestational hypertension does not require you to give them magnesium at the time of delivery. How about preeclampsia? So there's a small proportion of patients who have preeclampsia without severe features that can be managed as an outpatient. So I have a graph later on coming as to how to kind of evaluate patients with preeclampsia, but if they are in the hospital, you establish that they do not have severe disease and you want to monitor them as outpatient, you actually can send them home. But again, you have to do daily kick counts, you do daily monitoring of symptoms of any severe disease. Here for preeclampsia of any kind, you have to do twice weekly blood pressure checks. So I'm typically doing twice weekly testing on these patients anyways. So they come in for blood pressure twice a week. You do weekly labs to look for severe features. You give them antihypertensives, and then you can either manage them in the hospital, but most of the times I manage them as outpatient. And then again, similar to gestational hypertension, the delivery is really recommended around 37 weeks. Now, what about the most severe type of patients, preeclampsia with severe features? These patients should not be discharged home. They're actually managed inpatient. And again, the whole idea is that you give them antihypertensives to temporize the blood pressures and betamethasone because they're early on for fetal lung maturity. These patients should be given magnesium sulfate at the time that you're diagnosing them for the first 24 hours or so. So typically in our hospital, we do daily labs on them, even if they're normal for the first 2 to 3 days, and then space them out to twice weekly labs. They should get twice weekly biophysical profiles. And then for patients who have severe disease, we do serial growth scans every 2 to 3 weeks. You have to deliver them at 34 weeks unless they're pre-viable. So if you find a patient who has severe disease, severe preeclampsia, and they're less than 23 weeks, that's kind of the age of viability right now we're counting, or even less than 24 weeks, if you want to say that, you can offer them termination of pregnancy. And obviously, if they're more than 34 weeks, you should deliver them off the bat. These are the patients who would require magnesium prophylaxis. For seizure prophylaxis or magnesium sulfate, and this should be given antepartum, intrapartum, so while you're doing their C-sections or while they're laboring, and also postpartum 24 hours after. So how about what do we do for patients who have, for example, severe disease? And I know a lot of you guys are sending us patients. So what do we do in terms of how do we decide who gets delivered when, if they have severe disease? So patients who should be delivered regardless of how far along they are. There are certain very hard indications, such as if you have uncontrolled severe hypertension. So I will go through some protocols, but ACOG has outlined very good protocols about management of acute severe hypertension, antepartum, for example. So you start with labetalol, you can give them hydralazine, but once you have exhausted 2 medications completely and you still have uncontrolled severe hypertension, you should proceed towards delivery. And if you look at how frequently you give these medications, what I do is I have calculated that it's 2 hours of, in my mind, if you have more than 2 hours of severe hypertension, that is, you're treating it appropriately every 15 to 20 minutes, giving them labetalol and hydralazine per protocol, and you still have severe hypertension, that would be an indication for delivery. Eclampsia is an indication for delivery regardless of gestational age. If the patient is abruption, she's in DIC. Anytime you have non-reassuring fetal status, so obviously the whole idea of prolonging pregnancy in patients who have preeclampsia is really to get to a bigger gestational age. But if you have non-reassuring fetal status, if you have fetal demise, for example, You do not have to expectantly manage them, obviously, because the fetus is not there. And also, ACOG is very specific in saying that proteinuria is not an indication for delivery. So regardless of the amount of proteinuria has a very, very poor prognosis for in terms of as a marker for prognosticating adverse outcomes. So amount of proteinuria doesn't really affect your timing for delivery. What about patients that they're less than 34 weeks, you give them betamethasone, and then now you're kind of expectantly managing them, but then you have to deliver them before they get to 34 weeks. These will be the patients who have recurrent severe hypertension. So you manage their blood pressures early on with IV antihypertensives, then you start them on PO hypertensives, you're giving them betamethasone, and 2 days later, again, they have a massive episode of severe recurrent hypertension that you run out of all your medications to be used. Patients who have persistent symptoms of severe disease, so that will be most common is a headache. So if you have a headache, it disappears, you give them some Tylenol, some narcotics, and then the headache comes back and they're steroid complete. Patients who have HELLP or partial HELLP, any kind of lab abnormality, you should always be trying to figure out when you can deliver them. A lot of times I've seen that patients who have HELLP or partial HELLP, you can actually stabilize them for the first 24, 40 hours for them to get betamethasone, and then the labs are kind of the same. But then at the end of your betamethasone, you should deliver them. Patients who have really bad fetal disease, so if you have severe oligo, if you have reverse and diastolic flow, if you have recurrent variables, these are the patients that you can give them steroids and then you just like deliver them as soon as the steroids are done. If the patient is in labor, you should never try to stop labor in somebody who's got severe disease. Patients with significant renal dysfunction, again, you can temporize them for a day or two, but then you have to deliver them. And also patients who have a really bad BPP. So BPP of less than 4 out of 10, put them on continuous monitoring and hopefully try to see if you can finish the steroids. What about 34 weeks? For everybody, other people who reach 34-week mark without any of those things, making you deliver them right away or within 24 to 48 hours. So any patient with severe features should be delivered at 34 weeks. And also once we are beyond 34 weeks, if you're persistently bad BPP of 6 out of 10 or less, you can deliver them. What about HELLP syndrome? So HELLP syndrome is just a part of preeclampsia. It's one of the severe types of preeclampsia, which is hemolysis, elevated liver enzymes, and low platelets. Of course, if you're before the gestational age of viability or after 34 weeks, we should just deliver patients with HELLP soon after maternal stabilization. But if you're less than 34 weeks, like we talked about, you could potentially delay delivery for 24 hours if the maternal fetal condition is stable, just for the effect of steroids. So this is kind of the flowchart that I've been talking about for the past, several minutes. So this was published in AJOG in 2007, and I think it's an old chart now, but I think it's very, very valid. So essentially, what we do is, if you have patients who have severe preeclampsia and they're less than 34 weeks, they have to be admitted to labor and delivery area so that somebody can monitor them carefully. They need to have continuous kind of fetal evaluation for the first 24 hours. We give them IV magnesium for the first 24 hours. We treat them with their antihypertensives if they have severe systolic hypertension more than 160 or diastolic more than 110. And then obviously they're less than 34 weeks, so you give them steroids for fetal lung maturity. Then you see, okay, what else is going on with the patient? So if she has any of those things, eclampsia, pulmonary edema, renal failure, DIC, she has non-reassuring status, she's somehow more than 34 weeks, you can just deliver her before the steroids get completed. If none of those things are happening, you say, okay, what else is happening? If she has HELLP syndrome, if she has severe IGR, if she has reverse flow, persistent symptoms, if she's in labor, you then deliver them as soon as the steroids are done. So essentially, if nothing else is happening, so you don't have any of those severe end organ damage, and then the only thing I guess that remains is if you only have hypertension, which you can control, then you can offer them expectant management if they are between 24 and 34 weeks. But then obviously, like we talked about, you have to keep them in the hospital and do intense monitoring to look for deterioration of maternal or fetal condition. Again, this is a little bit old. It says if you're less than 24 weeks, you can actually counsel them termination of pregnancy. I think at our institution, we kind of pushed that back a little bit because our viability is 22 weeks. So we say, well, if you're less than 23 weeks and if you have severe preeclampsia or HELLP syndrome, we're gonna ask you to, at least counsel termination of pregnancy. So now we're going to talk about what to do after delivery. So ACOG says for all women who have new onset hypertension, so whether it's gestational hypertension, superimposed preeclampsia or preeclampsia, they need to have their blood pressure monitored for 72 hours. And then again, it's 7 to 10 days after delivery. So there's a mishmash, the slight difference between what ACOG says and what ILPQC is saying, but this is what ILPQ says, that they should be monitored for 72 hours. And then, if you let them go home, you should actually, especially on antihypertensives, you have to call them. and then 7 to 10 days after delivery. For all women, they should get discharge instructions. So when you're discharging them home, you should tell them how important it is, what are the different signs and symptoms of preeclampsia, and how important it is that you promptly report your signs and symptoms after delivery. Patients who have hypertension with headache or blood vision, and they're postpartum. So I'll tell you about the postpartum protocols that we have developed. But if you see patients who are coming back to the hospital with hypertension and headache, or if they have any visual symptoms, you have to actually give them magnesium, similar to what you would do when they're still pregnant. And then postpartum, you can actually treat their blood pressures if they're more than 150 over 100 on 2 occasions. So it's a little bit better than antepartum. You can treat them a little bit at a lower threshold. And then what happens beyond that? So various organizations have now recognized that preeclampsia is a risk factor for long-term cardiovascular disease. So American Heart Association, for example, have these guidelines saying that women who have preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, or pregnancy-induced hypertension, they should have follow-ups at least yearly, whereby they didn't really specify the time interval, but I'm interpreting it at least yearly, where you have to keep your blood pressures to level 1, so that's less than 120 over 80. You have to be advised about your lipids, fasting glucose, and BMI. And then all these lifestyle changes, they suggest that you should do, modification of your diet, regular physical activity, keep your weight less than BMI of less than 25. ACOG is pretty similar to that. They are saying that you should have patients who have, so ACOG only says patients who have preterm or recurrent preeclampsia. There is some science to it. I think the risk of cardiovascular disease is really high if you have recurrent preeclampsia or if you have preterm preeclampsia less than 37 weeks. They're saying you should see a primary care doctor every year, and that time you should manage your blood pressures, lipids, fasting glucose, and BMI, and the same things as AHA is saying. So at least some of these organizations are now actually saying what should be done to women when they have a prior history of preeclampsia. Now, just a couple of slides about what to do about if you see a woman who has a history of preeclampsia and you're seeing her. So obviously, it'll be nice to see them in the preconception visit, which most frequently doesn't happen for our patients. But if you find a patient who's there to talk to you before she gets pregnant, again, you can advise her weight loss and increasing physical activity. Actually, there are studies showing that weight loss prior to pregnancy will actually improve pregnancy outcomes. If she has chronic hypertension or diabetes, that should be optimally controlled prior to getting pregnant. You can review their medications, make sure they're not on any teratogenic medications such as ACE or ARBs, and then you can advise them some folic acid. Obviously, while they're pregnant, you want to do an early ultrasound to determine gestational age, because towards the end, when you're 37, 38 weeks, you don't have a good gestational age. That'll become really hard to determine what time you should deliver the patient. And then obviously, like we talked about, you have to do frequent visits and tailor to her prior history. And then we talk about it is that the low dose aspirin is actually the only thing that has been shown to reduce the risk of preeclampsia in your subsequent pregnancy. So you typically want to start it early in pregnancy, so at the end of your first trimester. ACOG says you can start it between 12 and 16 weeks, and you can even start it as late as 28 weeks, but it's not really sure. There's not much data of any benefit if it started really in the second trimester, but you could start it whenever you see the patient. So this is not from ACOG, but this is I just pulled it out from the Green Journal. But these are the risk factors in the aspirin use. Essentially, what it is to divide women into 3 different types of women. So you're at high risk to develop preeclampsia. This is all based on history. Moderate risk to develop preeclampsia, and low risk. So high risk patients are the ones who have a prior history of preeclampsia, especially if it's accompanied by an adverse outcome. So if you have prior history of preeclampsia, which is preterm, associated with preterm delivery, or you had an abruption or IUGR. If you have multifetal gestation in your current pregnancy, you have chronic hypertension, you have diabetes, kidney disease, autoimmune diseases such as lupus or antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. Any of these things are happening, you're at high risk. You should be taking aspirin, 81 milligrams starting at 12 weeks, even if you have only one of these risk factors. Then the moderate risk factors include nulliparity, BMI of more than 30. If you have a strong family history of preeclampsia with your mother or sister, you have a lower socioeconomic status or African American race, if your age is more than 35, or if you have other personal histories such as you yourself for low birth weight, or if you have previous adverse pregnancy outcome, just simply even having IUGR without prior pregnancy in your prior pregnancy, or you have a very long interpregnancy interval of more than 10 years. These are moderate risk factors. So ACOG says that you can take aspirin if you have more than one of these moderate risk factors. So one of the high risk factors, but at least 2 moderate risk factors. And then the low risk people are those who are Caucasian women who have a prior uncomplicated full-term delivery, which at least at University of Chicago, we don't have those kind of patients. So I think overall, a lot of us should be giving aspirin to a lot of our patients. So what is really not recommended, and this has been proven by previous even randomized trials for prevention of preeclampsia. So what is not recommended is vitamin C or vitamin E. So there's a big trials done for vitamin C and vitamin E, and they were proven to be not effective in preventing preeclampsia. Dietary salt restriction has not been recommended and should not be advised. And similarly, no amount of bed rest or restriction for physical activity in the current pregnancy should be advised in patients who have a prior history of preeclampsia. So we're going to spend the next 30 minutes, now that we know the preeclampsia is dangerous, as to see that what we can do as clinicians, as care providers, and what interventions we can actually perhaps put in place. And I'm going to mostly talk about what can we do at the level of our hospitals as a level of our entire system. So I can tell you how we did it. So our hospital journey was pretty similar to a lot of hospital journeys here in Illinois and other hospitals, is that we actually started by participating in that ILPQC, which was the Illinois Perinatal Quality Collaborative, which was a big collaborative that was happening in 2014. And essentially, they were interested in treating acute severe hypertension. It was a bundle which included treatment for acute severe hypertension, huddle, and discharge instructions. And then I'll show you some of the data from there. But essentially, we took that and we said, fine, we started treating our blood pressures better. We did all the huddles that were required as a part of ILPQC, but we thought that we fell short in terms of discharge instructions. So we created a program here at the University of Chicago, and we called it STAMP Hypertension, which is essentially focusing on postpartum blood pressure. So it's systematic treatment and management of postpartum hypertension. And just for everybody to know, our patient population is actually very high risk for postpartum complications, and they don't really come back for their postpartum visits. More than 85% of our patients are African American. They're young, and they are on Medicaid and obese. So all of these are really the risk factors for adverse outcomes that are related to preeclampsia. So what was ILPQC? I'm not going to go into much detail, but I know a lot of you guys participated in it. It was essentially just treatment of severe hypertension in pregnancy, and their main goal was to reduce the time to treatment. And they wanted to document potential barriers in each of the hospital systems. And it was a nice way to kind of roll it out, because it allowed individual hospitals to assess what they were doing, but also there was like you could put your data through the state, and there was a statewide assessment of what was going on. So again, I'm not going to go into much detail, but essentially what the program was that you take a blood pressure, and if it's severe, if it's more than 160 or 110, you define it as a severe range blood pressure. And what was the goal was that you have to identify it and treat it within 1 hour of identification. So then what do you have to do? You have to do a lot of things. You had to standardize the recognition of the severe hypertension, and then you have to deliver the care. So they were interested in helping institutions to figure out how to process and time of this initial delivery of care, what kind of debriefing processes, so that you can identify the barriers, whether it was not recognition of the blood pressure, whether you didn't have the antihypertensive, whether you didn't know how much to give, things like that. They also wanted hospitals to record any additional complications and issues that they encountered. And also they were very much interested in figuring out what kind of discharge planning and follow-up these patients are getting. So there was obviously a big potential for intervention, because this was guided by the CMQCC, which is Dr. Elliot Main again, who's in California. And essentially what they did was, like I told you previously, that there was a very good chance that you can alter the outcome for these patients. And then also there was obviously data that these maternal morbidity is actually quite frequent. And it is more frequently happening in patients who have severe hypertension. So a lot of data is out there saying that if you have severe hypertension, you have much more higher chances of having maternal morbidity than non-severe hypertension. And also there's data that the frequency of severe morbidity does not increase in worsening blood pressure. So once your blood pressure kind of reach that level of 160 or 110, you're at significantly high risk to have a severe morbidity. So it doesn't matter whether it's 170, whether it's 180 or 190. And also they showed that the higher rates of maternal morbidity was actually seen with lower levels of NICU care hospitals and lower delivery volume. So essentially there's high maternal morbidity, but then if you're in a hospital which has a lower delivery volume, perhaps they don't have the same system. So it was very much driven by a bundle approach that should just be employed hospital-wide and not really depending upon whether you're a big hospital or a small hospital. So there was a big call of action by ACOG by recognizing different safety bundles, and there's a safety bundle that was recognized and implemented for management of severe hypertension. And essentially there was risk assessment and prevention. So again, like I told you, you need to have a diagnostic criteria that define when to treat it. So within an hour, they defined what agents to use. It's mostly hydralazine, labetalol, and nifedipine, and what kind of monitoring you do. And then they were interested in readiness and response. So how do you escalate? So every hospital should have a complication escalation process. So once you run out of your medications, who do you call? You call the MFM, you call the cardiology. What kind of further evaluation? What if there's a change in status of the patient and postpartum surveillance? So the way they defined it was, like I said, was severe hypertension was defined in any patient who was sitting upright and if a blood pressure is more than 160 or 110. And essentially they said repeat and treat. So you repeat it within 15 minutes, and if it's higher at that 15-minute mark, you call it persistent hypertension, and then persistent hypertension has to be treated within 1 hour with some sort of an IV or oral nifedipine, some sort of a medication so that you can control it. And then they said that you have to recognize it that they are all the same. So whether it's happening antepartum, intrapartum, or postpartum, the definition of severe hypertension and treatment remains the same. The antihypertensive agents were IV labetalol and IV hydralazine, and the short-acting nifedipine, which ACOG says has shown similar effectiveness as IV medication. So there's less experience, but I actually use nifedipine quite frequently. It's a PO 10 or 20 milligrams, just a regular release nifedipine orally, not under your tongue. It's just oral. And then obviously for all of us to know that magnesium sulfate should be used in all patients who have severe hypertension, and epidural is not an antihypertensive. So neither is magnesium an antihypertensive, nor is giving them patients an epidural. If you have severe hypertension, it has to be treated with antihypertensive medications. Again, this is all available very nicely. If you go to the ACOG website, they have these beautiful flowcharts that you can actually incorporate into your Epic. That's what we ended up doing. So it's all an order set. So it comes up, for example, hydralazine 5 to 10 milligrams over 2 minutes, and then you just kind of, you can go through your protocol till you maximize your medications. So what did they suggest about discharge and follow-up? So they said that should you, at the time of discharge, we should review the warning signs and symptoms of preeclampsia so that we educate the women. And like I said, they were saying that when planning discharge for a hypertensive women, within 3 to 7 days, if she's discharged without medications. And then they said if she's being discharged within with medication, you should actually follow up within 72 hours. In our hospital, just like really difficult to discharge the patient on day 1, day 2, and then try to follow her up in day 3. So we routinely keep them here for 3 days and then follow them up in 7 to 10 days. This is from, again, I think a lot of people have seen this. This is the ILPQC sheet that they have, the data form that you had to collect information. When was your blood pressures, what medications, and then also in terms of in the bottom, there's like team issues, what went well, what needs improvement in like a basic kind of a huddle notes. So I want to point out in the last 15 minutes, kind of the importance of the postpartum period. So postpartum period is actually equally dangerous for women with preeclampsia. In fact, this was from the CDC last year, and they said that death can happen anytime up to 1 year. And it is so interesting to note that only 1/3 of the deaths are actually occurring during pregnancy, 2/3 of the deaths are occurring after delivery. So about 36% occur during delivery and 1 week postpartum. So very, very dangerous period. And the remaining 33% are happening 1 week to 1 year. So there's this period of like within a week of your delivery, you have a significant, I feel like risk for adverse outcomes, but also an opportunity to improve care. So while ACOG, we learned, it stresses the importance of postpartum care, such as ACOG says that you should, monitor patients by doing frequent blood pressure checks. You should have a cardiology follow-up, for example, for late postpartum care. However, there's lots of data that up to 40 to 60% of the women will not come back for their postpartum visits. So there's lots of data on one hand saying they are at risk, they can die, they have risk for cardiovascular disease, but the reality is that most of our women are actually not coming back for their postpartum visits. And this non-compliance, and I don't want to use it in a bad way, but this not being ability to come for your postpartum visits is actually quite high in African-American women. In fact, there are lots of studies that about only 30% of the African-American women actually seek care postpartum. So guided by all this data, and because we already had the ILPQC in the hospital, we said, fine, we're going to create a program specifically for patients for managing their postpartum blood pressures. So I'm sure you can read through this and recognize some of these problems that are occurring at your hospital too. But at least what I recognized at the time in our hospital, what was going on at the time when the patient is coming for admission. So somebody comes in and she's in labor or she's being diagnosed with preeclampsia and being induced, and now she's being discharged. I found that there was a general lack of knowledge among patients about effects of preeclampsia after delivery. So most people, if you ask them, they will think, even the nurses, they would think that preeclampsia gets better with delivery. She's fine, let her go home. There was actually no organized effort at the University of Chicago for education to our patients. We were not giving them discharge instructions, and we were telling them, well, you have to come back, you have to come back in 7 to 10 days. But really, we had no dedicated postpartum clinics for easy access. So we were really struggling where to see these patients back. Then if the patients came back and they were coming back to the ED, for example, so we went down to the ED and we found lots of problems in the ED, such as in our ED, they could not identify which are the patients who are postpartum. So there was no specific way to identify patients. There was no questions that the nurses were asking these patients, did you have a delivery in the past, 42 days or in the past 6 weeks? They had very poor knowledge and definition of postpartum hypertension. They could not define severity of postpartum hypertension. A lot of times the ED would call medicine or cardiology if the patient had hypertension or cardiac symptoms instead of OB, and there was a very delayed transfer to labor and delivery. And like I said, there was delay in recognition and treatment of severe postpartum hypertension. They did not have any protocols or medications, magnesium, IV antihypertensives in the ED to treat these patients. And then we had no standardized management for readmission. So even if the patient comes through the ED, they were just not really managed appropriately when they were readmitted. So what did we do? It just seemed like a very large task to kind of improve on all the things. So we created a STAMP hypertension team, which was essentially a large team of nurses and some of my medical students and my research staff, because I did want to collect some data around it. So what did we do? We created some goals. So our goals were essentially what we wanted to do. We wanted to improve the knowledge among our providers and patients. So we wanted to improve knowledge among all our nurses, all our residents, healthcare providers, as well as our patients. We wanted to appropriately and timely manage hypertension, not just antepartum and intrapartum, but also postpartum. Obviously, the end goal would be to reduce rates of complications that are related to hypertension. But the other goal, really a big goal, was we really wanted to see with all this education, we can improve the rates of follow-ups. We also wanted to manage the readmissions correctly. And then obviously the long-term goal is to improve their long-term blood pressures and follow-up, for example, with a primary care doctor or cardiology. And I can tell you for our sustainability, the biggest plus was we involved our nurses. On the right, you can see these pictures. Those are all my nurses. We got some funding from a blood pressure company called Emron. So they were giving us blood pressure cuffs initially for free, but now we buy them at a very subsidized rate. We do a lot of lunch and learn. So this is obviously pre-COVID. We are sitting there, for example, I did a preeclampsia, World Preeclampsia Day, so we celebrated it. We had a cake. We went around the whole mother, baby, labor and delivery, like telling people how, like what we are doing. And then I would just sit there on my desk, and then it's an open forum, so anybody can ask any questions. We also very recently, and I know IDPH requires it for all institutions now, we have the annual competency training that everybody has to do. And then I did a lot of Facebook Live and webinars. And then we started collecting some data so that we can show people that actually, simple education tools and follow-up appointments can actually make a difference in their blood pressures. So what is the program? So the program is pretty simple. So it has a video that every patient now has to watch when they come in for their labor and delivery, when they get admitted. Initially, it was only for preeclamptic patients. Essentially, I created the video here. You can find it on YouTube with my students and with my nurses. And it just tells the patients that what you have, preeclampsia doesn't get better with delivery, and you have to take care of yourself postpartum. We also bought these care pad sheets, and again, I can email you guys, but preeclampsiafoundation.org is a great website, and they give it to you for free. So you can go there and buy these care pad sheets, which you can just give it to each patient. It says you're still at risk after your baby is born. Then, like I said, we got blood pressure cuffs and monitors. So we are giving a free blood pressure cuff and monitor to every patient who delivers here and who has hypertension. We also bought these bracelets, and we on one side it says postpartum, on the other side it says preeclampsia. So we give these bracelets to all our patients to wear it as a medical alert bracelet. So if she goes to any other ED or some other place, people can recognize her. Then what we did was we actually standardized all our protocols. So the management of postpartum hypertension, I created protocols based on just like consensus and based on ACOG for how do you manage blood pressures. And I'll show you some of these protocols. We actually created postpartum hypertension clinics whereby these patients can come in. We hired a nurse who is essentially Colleen, who's essentially responsible for this entire education, and she makes the follow-up appointments for these patients. We are doing it telehealth now through phone. It's been extremely successful. And then we also worked on how do we readmit these patients and also the ED workflow. So obviously a lot of work went into it, but essentially this is their sheet that they now get. It's two-sided. On the front, it says, know your preeclampsia symptoms. We created this very simple. It's like coded by color. So what's your normal blood pressure? What's the hypertension crisis? Colleen then, puts their appointment date when you're supposed to come in. And before COVID, we're actually having them come in person. We write down what blood pressure medications you're taking. On the back side, it's very simple. It just tells you how to take your blood pressure, and then you can record your blood pressures. And when the patient comes back in 7 to 10 days, they actually bring this sheet, and we can actually review these blood pressures with them. We are pretty kind of, started education a little bit early in our clinics as well. So all our patients in the first trimester, they get this pamphlet. Again, you can buy them from the Preeclampsia Foundation. It says in the first trimester, talk to your doctor about providing you with aspirin. After 20 weeks, at least twice, I give this preeclampsia, this brown sheet to my patients, which tells you what is preeclampsia, what are the signs of preeclampsia, and then when they come back for their postpartum appointment, we give them these kind of, education around how preeclampsia affects your heart disease. So these are some of the protocols. Again, I don't think we have all the time to go through them. I do want to leave some time for questions, but essentially we just standardized it, color coded it. So it's very simple. It says what to do if your blood pressure immediately postpartum. So if you have mild hypertension, what is your blood pressure? How do you treat it? And when do you discharge the patient? So essentially, if you have severe gestational hypertension or severe preeclampsia, you stay for 3 days. We also kind of, again, very, very kind of busy slide, but we standardized what to do when you come in for readmissions. 2 things that we changed, which I can tell you is had the most major effect was, one was that we said that all patients have to be admitted to maternal fetal medicine. So essentially we said that they cannot be admitted to cardiology, radiology, wherever other services, neurology, they're mostly admitted to hospitalist service. We said they have to be admitted to an OB service who actually know how to treat postpartum hypertension. And again, we kind of, put magnesium in there for readmissions if you have never received magnesium, and if you have, even if you don't have neurological symptoms, but if you have neurological symptoms, you have to be remagged postpartum. And again, we created this, workflows. I actually printed them out. I color coded them so that it's easy to follow, and they're hanging everywhere in our labor and delivery. They hang in our mother baby. Then we created these postpartum hypertension clinics. Essentially, what we did was these clinics are now available pretty much every day of the week for easy access to patients. And on top of that, what I did was I actually also standardized what to do in these postpartum hypertension clinics. So this is essentially run by majority of them are physician assistants with our MFM colleagues. So essentially, depending on what your blood pressure is, you can adjust the medications in the clinic when they're coming back to you. And then we worked on the ED workflow, and we kind of standardized it and made it really, really simple. So essentially now in the ED, they have a pivot nurse, which is the nurse who triages all these patients. She has to ask only 2 questions. She has to ask the patient if you have delivered in the past 6 weeks, and she has to take a blood pressure. So blood pressure is high and she's delivered in the past 6 weeks. The patient she'll just call the OB resident. She'll just send the patient to labor delivery. If she has altered mental status or something else is going on, she'll call the nurse will call the OB resident. Now, on top of that, what we did was we really changed our workflows, and now all our patients are actually coming back to labor and delivery. So they're told when they're being discharged that if you're coming back for any symptom of preeclampsia, you do not have to go to the emergency room. You can come directly to labor and delivery. But I know there are a few patients who end up in the ED, so we had to work on that too. So what did we find? So again, quickly, what we found was essentially what common sense is that with all these interventions, with education to the providers and the patients and making appointments for them, we were able to improve the follow-up appointments, and we were actually able to reduce their blood pressures. So we actually just, this paper is not published yet, but we looked at data on about 1,000 patients. Their mean maternal age was 28 years, so these are young patients. Majority of them were in Medicaid, so 65% were in Medicaid. 80% of our patients in this cohort were African American, and majority of them had a diagnosis of preeclampsia gestational hypertension. And essentially what we showed was there was significant improvement in the rates of follow-up. So if you look only in African American patients. They started out with follow-up rates in September, December 2018, when we did not have this program, at about 30%, to now in October, November 2019, 54%. And also, not only there was improvement in postpartum visit just for the blood pressure, but also there was a significant improvement in the journal postpartum visit. So that went up from 27 to 39%. But overall, if you look at all patients, it went up from 57 to 80%. So they were just in general coming back. But what was very, very kind of good to note, that blood pressures immediately postpartum. So these are blood pressures within the first 24 hours of delivery. If you see the number of patients who are hypertensive were 80% in the beginning, and now they're cut in half, so they're 46%. But what was also very, very important, that in the immediate postpartum period, if you look at the severity of severe postpartum hypertension, more than 160 over 110, at the beginning of the program, we had about 31% of the patients who had severe hypertension postpartum, and towards the end of the program, we had significant reduction. Only 7% of the patients had significant severe postpartum hypertension. Yes, because we were treating the blood pressures appropriately. And then this effect continued. So this was reduction in blood pressures at the postpartum visit, but also significant reduction in blood pressures at the 6-week visits in the beginning, defined as, so now that you're 6 weeks, so your hypertension is still defined as 140 over 90. About 25% of the patients were hypertensive. And with all these interventions that we are doing in the hospital, all throughout during the 6 weeks, the rates of hypertension reduced to 14%. So what we're doing at the University of Chicago, so we just are going to also evaluate the effect of a program on other metrics. I'm very interested in seeing how did it actually affect our readmission rates in terms of, did we actually change the timing, amount of time that the patients were spending in the ED? What was the time taken to treat severe hypertension if you're coming back for readmissions in the postpartum period? What was the medication used and how frequently the medications were adjusted? We are actually also developing a patient kind of driven guideline, concordant motivational and educational messaging, because I feel like we've never kind of asked our patients what kind of message they would want to receive for their management of their own blood pressures. And then I think what we're going to do as a University of Chicago, we're actually moving towards telehealth and remote patient monitoring for all our patients who are postpartum. Now, this is a question that I commonly get: where do you begin? So I think what you have to do, you have to create a team of diverse members. You cannot all be the same. So you need like only one of each type. So you need some physicians. You need obviously all your nurses, anesthesiologists, pharmacists, managers. You really have to just involve everybody who has something to do with the patient. You can also compare your hospital with bundle elements. So you can start out by saying, okay, let me see where is the gap. So that's called gap analysis. So in our hospital, we found there was a big gap, for example, in the postpartum period. So maybe in your hospital, it's not the postpartum. Maybe in your hospital, it's the antepartum. Then you really focus on the areas that are also easiest to implement. So you need some early wins. So you can just start out with one thing and you can say, okay, let me just fix this. And then that will give you like an initial start. I think the thing is that you have to really identify potential barriers and really honestly try to address them in your setup. Then obviously you can improve on communication response and reliable processes, such as I think huddles and debriefing are a great way to figure out what went wrong, what went right, and how do we do that differently or better the next time. And then keep the debriefing, like I said here, very, very simple. It should be timely. So you can't debrief something that happened two weeks ago. You have to kind of debrief it in real time. And it should be kind of thought-provoking, and it should not be kind of anytime punitive. And then, like we did, I think one of the biggest successes that I can tell you is this networking through food. So we would do lunch with Learn and Lunch. So we would bring some pizza, and then people would just come there in the lunchtime and try to learn something about preeclampsia. But you can put things on your bulletin boards. You can create some posters and kind of like, create. And a lot of resources are actually available on the ILPQC website, as well as the the California website. So I'm going to stop here, and I know kind of running short on time, but happy to take a few questions.
So Dr. Rana, there is one question in the chat box for you. And it says, what are your oral drugs of choice and dosage for the postpartum inpatient preeclampsia and also in the office? And how long do you think they'll stay on the PO medications?
So good question. So I think if you ask me, and there have been trials done to look at the efficacy of labetalol versus nifedipine. I feel like typically a lot of these patients are already on one of these medications during their antepartum course because a lot of them have severe disease. So if they are already on labetalol, I kind of continue them on labetalol. The chart that I made is like kind of tells you how much you can reduce it or add a second agent. I think for me personally, nifedipine is better because it just has better compliance. It's only once a day. In my mind, most of these patients, and again, I haven't looked at the data in Chicago, but there's data other places. Most patients should be able to get off their antihypertensives. In fact, majority of them in the first 2 to 4 weeks. So there's a small proportion of patients who are still needing antihypertensives in 6 weeks. So there's really no first line. You can start either. If the patient is naive and this is the first time that you're starting her on, you can just start her on nifedipine. I think that would be easy for the patient. I also, in patients of chronic hypertension, I switch them typically to their pre-pregnancy regimen, towards the end of their 6 weeks. So you can take them over to, if they're on hydrochlorothiazide regularly, you can perhaps switch them back to their antihypertensives towards the end of their 6 weeks.
And then someone did ask if we can email that price algorithm.
Yeah, so I think if you have these slides, they are all on the slides. So if you make a PDF of it and just email people the slides,
Yeah.
you can download from the PDF. And you can modify it. I mean, some of the language in the bottom is about my phone numbers. So you can obviously change it to your own phone numbers. And you can change it if you don't have a cardiologist, you can change it to hospitalist. But I think whatever it is, just put something in place and go over and over again with your providers to see if they can actually follow it.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Rana?
Do you use nicardipine drips, and how often are you using them?
Yeah, very rarely. I can tell you that sometimes in the patients I've had, frequently, I would say not very frequently, but maybe once every 2 months or so. We do put patients on nicardipine drip, but those patients typically I deliver them if they're antepartum, and then they go to the ICU for management of their drips. If they're postpartum, we evaluate them on our floor, try to manage their hypertension with IV antihypertensives for ACOG, and if they're requiring a lot more than that, then we send them to the medicine floor to the ICU. But yeah, we do put patients on drips. Actually, the rates of severe hypertension is very high in this hospital. Yeah, so yeah, set in the ICU. So yeah, we typically send them to the ICU. We don't have our labor and delivery is not set up for I mean, it's kind of set up for ICU level care, but not definitely to the care that these patients will need for a continuous drip.
I have a question about eclampsia. If someone starts seizing, what's your fire drill protocol for somebody seizing? What do you do in order? Because I just saw Baha Sabai speak on this, and he's like, don't stop the seizure, stabilize the patient or whatever. So I guess I'm just wondering what's your protocol?
Yeah, so that's a very good point you brought up, that all of us should be doing drills in a non-emergent situations for hemorrhage and for eclampsia. I mean, at least those 2 drills should be done, and even for management of severe hypertension. So typically, if you have a patient with seizure, first of all, you have to make sure that she's actually, not totally obtunded. So I've had patients who are just not able to maintain their airway, so they get intubated. But most patients, once they're done with their seizure, they'll be in this post-ictal state. So magnesium is the way to go, and then controlling their blood pressures, figuring out how the baby looks on the monitor. A lot of times, if eclampsia can happen at term, which is more common. you obviously, move towards delivery based on it. Obviously doesn't really mean C-section, but past few, I don't know if because of COVID, but the rates of eclampsia are actually going at least up in our institution. So for the past few eclamptics that I've managed, you obviously lay them to their side, you call anesthesia, you make sure that they don't throw up. They're able to maintain their airway, so they're conscious. You start them on magnesium, just your 6 and 2. You check their labs, you manage their blood pressures, and then if they are just in the postictal state, and they're usually most of these patients that recover and they're lucid after that, after several minutes, and then you just move towards delivery, whether it's induction or if it's really preterm or breech or something, then you can obviously do a C-section. That's what I would do. But drills are very important because we can't even assimilate all the people. You need your anesthesia there. You need obviously your OB there, to kind of your nurses there, so that everybody knows that patient is seizing or patient is having an eclamptic seizure. Obviously put in the Foley to make sure that she's making urine, and check all her labs to make sure she doesn't have help. The last patient I had with eclamptic seizure, I ended up sectioning her because she was just unconscious. I'm also doing head CTs on pretty much all these patients postpartum. So obviously you don't get time while they're still pregnant, but I'm definitely doing, especially if they have persistent neurological symptoms, if they have headaches, and we find microhemorrhages and definitely evidence of edema. So you can start out with a non-contrast CT and then follow it up with an MRI, with a contrast MRI and MRA postpartum. All right.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that's it. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. If you are a nurse and you're on the call, I did put in the evaluation in the chat box, so you should be able to click on that link and fill out your evaluation, and then you should get a CE from me within about 48 hours. But otherwise, thank you all for joining, and thank you, Dr. Rana, for sharing your information.
And we'll make the slides available, and I think Autumn is going to put this on YouTube as well, so you can obviously modify them based on how you want to educate your staff.
Yes. All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.